Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. In the quiet, polished corridors of Newman Enterprises, where power had always spoken louder than verity, a storm was gathering, one that would not be stopped by plutocrat, pitfalls, or indeed the iron will of Victor Newman himself. For decades, Victor had ruled Genoa City like a kingmaker, shaping fates, breaking adversaries, and guarding his family heritage with ruthless perfection. Yet nothing in his long-advised life had prepared him for the disclosure that was about to tear open old injuries and expose a retired chapter of treason, love, and consequence. This wasn't simply a commercial ambush or a hostile preemption. This was blood. This was family. And this time Victor Newman would not be the one holding all the cards. The verity surfaced not with a bang, but with a tale. An unsettling murmur that traveled through Genoa City before landing exactly at Victor's door. It began with questions girding Matt, a man whose presence had lately unsettled the megacity's fragile balance. Matt was no foreigner to contestation, nor to secrets, but the rumors tying him to the Newman family felt different, heavier. There were aesthetics changed in boardrooms, hushed exchanges at the Crimson Lights, and a growing sense that commodity monumental was about to surface. Victor dismissed it at first. He always did. Rumors were currency in Genoa City, and he'd outlived them all. But this one refused to die. For Nick Newman, the pressure was suffocating. He felt it in his bones long before the evidence surfaced. There was commodity hauntingly familiar about Matt. His erraticisms, his temper, indeed the way he looked at Victor with an admixture of resentment and hankering. Nick tried to explain it, telling himself that participated traits meant nothing in a megacity erected on concurrence and chaos. Yet the feeling dallied, eating at him, refusing to be ignored. Nick had spent his entire life scuffling with his identity under Victor's towering shadow, fighting to be his own man. Now, the possibility that he might partake his blood with someone outside the family structure Victor had so precisely constructed hovered to upend everything Nick allowed. He knew about himself. When the verity eventually surfaced, it did so through cold, inarguable substantiation. Documents, medical records, and DNA results silent, unprejudiced substantiations painted a picture no bone could refute. Matt wasn't a stranger. He wasn't simply connected to the Newmans through circumstance or business. He was family. More precisely, he was Nick's family. The disclosure struck like a lightning bolt, unyoking the Newman heritage straight down the middle. Victor, a man who flattered himself on knowing every secret worth knowing, was blindsided. For the first time in times, maybe decades, Victor Newman was truly shocked. Victor's response wasn't explosive at first. There was no immediate shouting, no sonorous protestation of war. Rather, there was silence, a dangerous, nipping silence that spoke volumes. His mind contended through the history, reconsidering choices he'd buried long agone, faces he'd tried to forget, opinions made in moments of weakness or ambition that he believed had been cancelled by time and success. But time, as Victor was now forced to defy, doesn't abolish the verity. It simply waits for the right moment to resurface. And this moment had arrived with merciless perfection. Nick, meanwhile, was unraveling. The knowledge that Matt was his family reframed his entire history. Every argument with Victor, every rebellion, every moment of feeling like he no way relatively fit into the Newman earth suddenly carried new weight. Was Victor's complicated relationship with him embedded in guilt? Was Nick's lifelong struggle for independence fueled by commodity deeper than colliding personalities? The questions entwined, each one further painful than the last. Nick wasn't just scuffling with the actuality of a family. He no way knew he was defying the possibility that his life had been shaped by a taradiddle. Matt's perspective was no less complex. For times he'd lived with fractions of a story, pieces that no way relatively formed a complete picture. He'd known there was further to his history, further to his origins, but the verity had been precisely obscured. Learning that he was Victor Newman's son, and Nick's family, was not a palm. It was a reckoning. Matt didn't arrive in Genoa City seeking acceptance or remission. He came seeking answers. And now that he'd them, the weight of what Victor had taken from him, time's identity, family, settled heavily on his shoulders. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Within the Newman family, Alliances shifted and commitment were tested. Long-standing pressures burned again as each member was forced to defy what this disclosure meant for them. Victor's authority, formerly unquestioned, began to fracture. His children, who had spent their lives either fighting for his blessing or revolting against his control, now saw him in a new light, not just as an important primogenitor, but as a man able of insupportable deception. The foundation of the Newman conglomerate, erected as much on fear as on respect, began to crack. Nick brazened Victor not with rage but with disappointment, a far more ruinous blow. He demanded answers not as an inferior or a rival, but as a son who had been denied the verity. Victor tried to justify his conduct, framing them as necessary as defensive. But the words chimed concave. For maybe the first time, Victor's precisely constructed narrative failed to move indeed himself. The consummation that his hunt for control had bring him the trust of his son and conceivably ever, was a bitter lozenge to swallow. As the secret spread through Genoa City, responses poured in from every corner. Old adversaries set up new security. Old musketeers questioned their commitment. The disclosure of Nick and Matt's brotherhood was further than a particular reproach. It was a seismic shift that hovered to reshape the megacity's power dynamics. Newman Enterprises, long seen as an extension of Victor's will, suddenly appeared vulnerable. Investors rumored. Rivals watched nearly, staying for the perfect moment to strike. Victor, who had always thrived in chaos, now set up himself at its mercy. At the heart of it all was a simple, ruinous verity: family cannot be controlled like a pot. Blood ties don't bend to strategy or intimidation. Nick and Matt, bound by a participated father and a participated sense of loss, were forced to navigate a relationship neither had chosen, but both could no longer ignore. There was wrathfulness between them, yes, but also curiosity, and an implied understanding that they were victims of the same deception. Whether they would come abettors or adversaries remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: their bond would ever alter the Newman heritage. Victor's shock gradationally gave way to sweat, not of losing power, but of losing his family. For a man who had always equated strength with dominance, this was strange home. He stood at a crossroads, faced with a choice: he could manipulate or outthink. He could continue down the path of denial and control, risking total insulation. Or he could defy his history, admit his miscalculations, and accept the consequences of his conduct. For Victor Newman, the ultimate test was no longer about winning. It was about reckoning. Victor's studies spun endlessly as he sat in his office, the skyline of Genoa City stretching beyond the windows. A megacity he'd controlled, told, and manipulated for decades, now acting alien, unstable, and hanging. The disclosure of Matt as Nick's family was further than a domestic shock. It was a seismic blow to the precisely constructed edifice of his life. Every decision he'd made, every strategic marriage, accession, and business initiative, now bore the weight of this retired verity. He flashed back the first time he'd learned of Matt's actuality, or rather, the partial hints that had reached him times ago, whispers buried in sanitarium records, detail mentions in non-public reports, details that he'd dismissed as inconsequential or misreported. Yet now, with certain substantiation gaping him in the face, those discarded fractions took on a new minatory clarity. He'd missed commodity, allowed it to mold, and that oversight could bring him everything. The room felt colder than usual, despite the warm downtime sun discovering through the windows. Victor Newman, the man who had goggled down CEOs, crews, and political adversaries, the man who had formerly turned a hostile preemption into a family gathering, now felt a strange shiver of vulnerability that eroded at the edges of his control. Meanwhile, Nick wandered the halls of Newman Enterprises in a state of restless agitation. He could hear the whispers among workers, the subtle changes in the way associates and directors addressed him, the curious gapes that suggested someone nearly knew the full compass of the secret. It wasn't simply that Matt was, it was that the megacity now knew. Genoa City, which thrived on secrets and dishonors, had suddenly been handed a disclosure of monumental proportions, and Nick felt exposed, stripped of certainty in a life that had been precarious enough indeed under Victor's tyrannous guidance. He recalled arguments with Victor, times he'd tried to sculpt out his own identity, and suddenly once grievances that had sounded particular now felt like part of a larger, more ruinous pattern. Questions of trust, fidelity, and treason swirled endlessly. Why had Victor hidden Matt from him? How numerous other pieces of his life were grounded on manipulated trueness. Did he indeed know who he was presently? In those moments of quiet despair, Nick realized that the true battleground wasn't commercial. It was intimate, cerebral, and necessary, one that would demand battle, reckoning, and maybe remission that he wasn't yet ready to extend. Matt, for his part, approached the disclosure with a complicated blend of fury, unbelief, and a reticent curiosity. He'd spent times making together fractions of his life, stories of his natural mama, legal documents, clashing testaments, and now, brazened with the inarguable verity that he wasn't simply connected to the Newmans, but one of them. The feelings surged like a storm drift. He plotted with identity, wondering if his ambition, his temper, and indeed his moral compass had been shaped unconsciously by genes and parenting, by a father whose influence he'd no way known he bore. The questions were endless and exhausting. What did Victor's concealment signify about his own value? Was he less because he'd been hidden? Was he more because he'd survived without the advantages of the Newman name until now? Each study sounded to pull him in different directions, leaving him insulated in a crowd, a foreigner in his own birth. And yet, indeed, in the midst of confusion, a thread of determination surfaced. Matt wasn't a man who allowed circumstances to mandate his fortune. He'd defy Victor, defy Nick, and defy the involved web of secretiveness that had governed his life, indeed if it meant challenging the veritably core of the Newman dynasty. The battle between Victor and Matt was ineluctable, and when it passed, it was far from dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was rather deeply cerebral, a meeting charged with suppressed emotion, implied guilt, and a tense turnabout of trouble. Victor, who had formerly faced physical troubles with ease, now set up himself vulnerable in a way that frightened him. His authority, his precisely maintained image of infallibility, and his understanding of family scale were each at threat. He spoke with the measured tone of a man who tried to control not only the discussion but the emotional tenor, but Matt could see the cracks beneath the face, the slight earthquake in Victor's hands, the inappreciable vacillation before a response, the way his eyes flitted with recollections more left buried. For Matt, the meeting was both in blameworthiness and a demand explanation, acknowledgement, and maybe in reason for decades of obfuscation. And yet Victor's response, steeped in decades of pride and guard, offered little resolution. He spoke of protection, of necessity, of opinions made in the environment of a world where power frequently equaled survival, but in doing so, he revealed the veritably mortal vulnerability that Nick and Matt had no way seen in him ahead. Nick, witnessing the commerce between his father and his newfound family, felt a alluvion of feelings: relief, covetousness, confusion, and the flicker of domestic fidelity. He could see Matt's struggle, the fierce desire for autonomy tempered by the hankering for connection, and it imaged his own internal conflict. For Nick, this wasn't simply a discovery of siblinghood. It was an occasion to review what family meant, to negotiate connections with Victor and Matt from a place of verity, rather than manipulation. Yet, every step forward was visited by the specter of treason. What if Victor's control extended beyond concealment? What if other secrets lurked, staying to unravel the fragile trust they were beginning to rebuild? Nick's instinct to cover, to lead, and to assert agency came a balancing act, one that needed careful navigation through emotion, strategy, and the murky waters of commercial conspiracy. Beyond the Newman walls, Genoa City itself sounded to reply to the disclosure as if it were a living reality. Business associates recalculated alliances, challengers stoned strategies, and the media, both formal and informal, circulated rumors with festive vehemence. Newman enterprises, long perceived as monolithic and insurmountable, now appeared susceptible to internal turbulence. Investors questioned the stability of leadership, board members counted commitment, and workers rumored about nepotism, favoritism, and implied conflicts. The ripple effect of one retired verity extended far beyond family drama. It had the eventuality to disrupt entire diligence, shift power balances, and expose vulnerabilities that Victor had spent decades strictly concealing. Every move he made, every word he spoke was now scanned for hints of guilt, instability, or insecurity. For Victor, who had erected his life around the vision of control, the consummation that control was now illusory was intimidating. In private moments, Victor reflected on his own life, recalling opinions driven by ambition, fear, and a desire to save the Newman heritage. He considered the moral math that had led him to hide Matt from Nick, the apologies, the pretenses, the belief that shielding the family from inconvenient trueness was a form of protection. And yet, in these introspective moments, he could no longer deny the cost. Connection strained, fidelity tested, and the emotional risk on his children were consequences he could no longer manage with power alone. Victor's shock evolved into a profound reckoning. Maybe his topmost palms had been Pyrrhic, concave achievements shadowed by deception, and the veritably mortal consequences of secretiveness. Matt and Nick's relationship sluggishly began to form a fragile, tense alliance. Exchanges oscillated between fellowship and conflict, each hassle concentrated with implied grievances, conservative curiosity, and conditional attempts at collective understanding. There were moments of warmth, small, transitory, but they were interspersed with pressure and dubitation, each testing the limits of trust. They explored participated nonage traits, bandied constructive jests, and suspected on the implied ways their lives had intertwined indeed before they knew each other. And through it all, the memory of Victor's concealment hung over them, a memorial that family bonds, no matter how biologically certain, are complicated by history, emotion, and the choices of those who came ahead. Meanwhile, Victor plotted to assert his influence over a shifting geography. He tried to reassert authority, convening strategic meetings, issuing directives, and engaging in accommodations designed to demonstrate control. Yet the dynamics had changed irreversibly. Matt's presence was a variable Victor could manipulate, and Nick's constancy was no longer irrefutable. Each decision Victor made was colored by the mindfulness that his children now held information and agency that could undermine him. Indeed, abettors who had formerly remitted to his judgment now questioned, second-guessed, and subtly maneuvered, seeing that a crack in Newman authority had eventually appeared. The story of Nick and Matt's brotherhood came a narrative larger than the family itself, one that encompassed fidelity, treason, identity, ambition, and the enduring struggle for power. It was a tale representational of Genoa City itself, a megacity erected on secrets, yet defined by the grim pursuit of verity, still destabilizing it might be. Victor, Nick, and Matt were each forced to defy their own limitations, solicitations, and vulnerabilities. The disclosure reshaped not only family dynamics but business strategies, social alliances, and the megacity's perception of the Newman conglomerate. Each character was tested, pushed to emotional axes, and impelled to defy questions that had no easy answers. Can trust be rebuilt after decades of concealment? Can power attend with conciliation? Can blood ties heal injuries created by secretiveness? By the time Genoa City had begun to absorb the enormity of the disclosure, the cityscape itself sounded charged with pressure, as if the thoroughfares, boardrooms, and social circles all bucketed with expectation for the coming turn of events. Victor, though shaken, resolved not to retreat entirely. Nick, balancing curiosity and dubitation, sought to forge a path forward that recognized both his individuality and his newfound connection to Matt. Matt, determined to claim his place within a family he'd been denied, moved cautiously but intensively, knowing that alliances, understanding, and acceptance would bear tolerance, strategy, and emotional adaptability. In the end, the disclosure that Nick and Matt were sisters was further than a shock. It was a catalyst, a gauntlet through which every member of the Newman family, and indeed the megacity itself, would be tested, reshaped, and ever converted. The story continued, an intricate weave of ambition, love, resentment, and conciliation, leaving no character untouched, no relationship unchanged, and no power structure unchallenged. It was a disclosure whose foreshocks would resonate for times, altering lives, patrimonies, and the veritably substance of what it meant to belong to the Newman family. As days passed, the disclosure of Nick and Matt's brotherhood began to percolate every corner of Newman Enterprises and the wider social circles of Genoa City. Staff who had formerly moved unquestioningly under Victor's direction now dithered, casting furtive ganders at each other, seeing the subtle but inarguable shift in power. Meetings came tense, with directors importing each word and gesture against the background of the Newman family reproach. Indeed, casual exchanges in the halls carried double meanings. Whispers of alliances and backstabbings hung in the air like a storm about to break. Victor, ever watchful, tried to project calm authority, but indeed he could hide the subtle severity in his posture, the way his eyes danced at unanticipated entrances, or the cold pressure that now curled around his every commerce. For Nick, the disclosure touched off an ongoing internal struggle. Each hassle with Matt brought swells of clashing feelings: wrathfulness at the decades of secrets, admiration at the unanticipated connection, and